In today's video, I'm going to talk about this RTX 3090 Ti Suprim X from MSI, which is their top-of-the-line graphics card. And even though I still have a lot of thoughts about the 3090 Ti's in general, I still do think it is interesting to see how this card performs, and even more so, what MSI did to deal with a GPU that pulls almost 500 watts of power. So without further ado, let's check it out.
This video is brought to you by Seasonic and their Prime series power supplies. These top quality power supplies are very efficient, they're whisper quiet, extremely reliable, and my go-to choice for most of my test rigs and builds around here. And to make the deal even sweeter, Seasonic wraps it all up in a cozy 12-year-long warranty. Check them out using the links in the description below.
So as I mentioned before, the RTX 3090 Ti uses the same chip as the RTX 3090, but now that chip is fully unlocked. So it has a few cores more, it has higher clock speeds and faster memory, which makes it about 10% faster than the 3090 when gaming on a 4K resolution. If you look at lower resolutions, for example, that number will go down because you will run into more CPU bottlenecks. So I would say this card is really made for 4K gaming, and you shouldn't really consider it for anything else really. It is also 15 to 20% ahead of the 3080 and a 6900 XT, so the performance alone is quite impressive, and that is before we start adding things like ray tracing and DLSS that kind of give NVIDIA another advantage. But unfortunately, it is just crazy expensive. So the cheapest RTX 3090 Ti's are going for around 2,250 euros here in the Netherlands. But then a premium card like this one, for that you will have to pay closer to 2,400 euros, and that is just so much money for a GPU. Now keep in mind that the prices have been dropping recently, and you can actually get an RTX 3080 for under 1,000 euros, which means that you will be paying more than double for maybe up to 20-ish% more performance. And 20% is not little per se, but that price means that it will only make sense if you have way too much money. You use your GPU to make money from a business perspective, for example, or you really need 24 gigabytes of VRAM. But still, MSI kind of managed to make a pretty impressive card. They took the already massive RTX 3090 Suprim and they made it even thicker. So now it is more than 3 slots thick, and it is very heavy as well. They reinforced it everywhere to make it feel extremely rigid, and the quality of the finish is just excellent. Now, of course, you get a ton of RGB on top of that, and if you're not into RGB, you can also just turn it off. Feature-wise, you get a dual BIOS, so you can swap between a slightly faster and a slightly quieter profile, and there is a fan stop feature that keeps this card completely silent during a light use. They also include a nice GPU holder, which is really great to have, as even really well-built GPUs will sag in some cases, and you know, nobody likes a saggy GPU. Now, the power comes from that new 12+4 pin power connector that is standard on all 3090 Ti's, and I personally like it way more than having 3 bulky old school 8-pin connectors. There's just less cables on the front to deal with, and it just looks better right away. They did include that necessary splitter cable, but it is pretty short. So like I've said before in my previous reviews, check if your power supply manufacturer is offering these cables for your power supply. So I'm using a 1300 watt Seasonic Prime here, and Seasonic does ship these cables to anyone that bought a GPU with this connection, and I think that several other brands do that as well. So make sure that you check whichever brand you have. On the back, you also get 3 DisplayPort 1.4 connections and 1 HDMI 2.1 connection. So according to specs, a reference RTX 3090 Ti is supposed to boost to 1860 MHz, while this card is factory OC'd and should boost to 1950 MHz. But as always, the specs mean very little, and in the default silent BIOS, this card actually boosts to 2010 MHz, and in the gaming BIOS, it averages at 2046 MHz. Now, that is slightly lower than the water-cooled ROG card, but in practice, those differences are actually very small. It is maybe a 1% performance difference between the ROG and this MSI when running both in their fastest modes, which is definitely not something you will ever notice while gaming. Now, the memory speeds, on the other hand, are the same on both cards. The power consumption of all 3090 Ti's is extremely high, and this card is pulling around 475 watts while gaming, regardless of which BIOS setting you choose, as the BIOS kind of just seems to affect the fan curve. Now, this is a ton of power just to power your graphics card, and that is definitely something to think about. Now, I know that if you can afford a GPU like this one, you may not care about your power bill, but in some countries, like the Netherlands, for example, every evening of gaming with this card will add a couple of euros to your power bill, and that kind of adds up way quicker than you think. So you should definitely not skip this detail. So much power also generates a lot of heat, and to be honest, it is pretty impressive to see how easily this card can handle that amount of heat. Now, both BIOS profiles show excellent thermals on both the GPU cores, the hotspot, and the memory as well. Everything is cooled extremely well with surprisingly reasonable noise levels. Now, personally, I think the quieter profile is nicer at 42 decibels, but still both are reasonable options, and neither is super loud nor super hot, so you can actually just pick whichever fits you best. Compared to the water-cooled ROG card, the temperatures are a little bit higher at roughly similar noise levels, but that really isn't something you should think about too much, because if your GPU is running at sub 60 degrees or high 60s, it doesn't really matter because both are completely fine. But both designs actually have their own advantages too. A water-cooled card can use the external radiator to kind of dump those 500 watts of heat instantly outside your case, making it easier for your case. And a big GPU like this Supreme is actually easier to fit generally, as you don't really need to mount that radiator somewhere, and it kind of looks cleaner because you don't have to deal with the extra cables. But you will need to make sure that your case has enough airflow to actually get rid of all that hot air. So please do not forget about airflow if you go for this card. So products like these are really difficult to place, in my opinion. So on one hand, you have this card that is pretty impressive, that runs insanely fast. It looks great, the heatsink is massive, and it has really good thermals considering the fact it uses almost 500 watts of power. But it is also super expensive, especially when you compare it to a more reasonable 3080 or a 3080 Ti. It requires a bigger power supply, it uses a lot more power, and it just doesn't make sense to get it if the rumors are true and the RTX 4000 series will be out in a few months. So yeah, if you can hold off buying a new GPU for a little bit longer, that is probably the best thing to do. But if you really need a GPU right now and you want to spend your money reasonably, I would actually go for a 3080 or a 3080 Ti. So, only if you want the best performing card and you really don't care about the stupid amount of money it will cost you, or you don't care about your power bill for that matter, this card will do just fine. Now, that's it for today. Let me know in the comments down below what are your thoughts about this RTX 3090 Ti and if you would ever get it for yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye guys!